Next, we move on to a story with a fascinating headline, and this sparked an awful lot of conversation, and I think it bears closer examination. The headline is "Twins get some mystifying," in quotation marks, mystifying results when they put 5 DNA ancestry kits to the test. Geneticist at a popular ancestry company admits it's kind of a science and an art. This is the story of a presenter on a show called Marketplace, called Chelsea Agro, and her twin sister Carly, having submitted their identical, or essentially identical, DNA to 5 companies: Ancestry DNA, MyHeritage, 23andMe, Family Tree DNA, which we may mention in a second in regards to another story, and a company called Living DNA. They mailed samples of their DNA, presumably cheek swabs, to each company for analysis, and the results that they got back were subtly but also very meaningfully different, and as the headline says, little bit mystifying. So do you want to break down the results as presented in the graph here?
Well, yeah, the 23andMe graph is the most striking one, and we're looking here at CBC's own coverage. So I think this is a CBC investigation, basically, to look at how these DNA companies work and what the results say when they can be said to say when they come back. Okay. Yeah, you've got Carly and Chelsea, identical twins. So you'd think that the DNA results would be broadly almost identical, if not completely identical. But in fact, when you look at the bar graph that we have here, 23andMe, Carly has 37% Italian, Chelsea is 38% Italian. Okay, maybe there's a margin for error or whatever. Again, a DNA specialist might be able to explain minor variations like that. Eastern European, slightly wider variation, 28% to 25%.
Yeah.
We go to Balkan ancestry, broadly Balkan ancestry, and we've got 14%, 15%. So again, only that 1% margin of error. We've got 12% and 13% others. Again, 1%. Okay,
Well, and others, it should be said, includes Iberian, broadly Southern European, Western Asian, North African and Arabian, Western Asian and broadly Western Asian and North African.
In other words, so everything they hadn't thought of in any of the other categories.
Yeah, so other human, yeah.
Yes,
okay,
other human lines.
Yeah.
But the really striking one is what they define as broadly European. Now, I guess you and I are broadly European. Having said that, I can't say that because I haven't had my DNA tested. But anyway, broadly European. Carly's 13% broadly European. Chelsea comes out at roughly 2%, 3% broadly European. So you've got one sister who's much more broadly European than the other. Now, how do you explain that one?
But what's also interesting though is they have a separate category here, which is French and German.
Yes.
So Chelsea, who is 2 or 3% broadly European, is also 2 or 3% French and German, whereas Carly is 13% broadly European, but not French or German.
Absolutely.
But what does that even mean? And that really highlights one of the problems here, in so much as one of the underreported facts of these sorts of services is that this sorts of analysis requires an awful lot of interpretation, and in order to pick out certain elements of someone's ancestry and background, what the company is doing, what the specific algorithms that they use are doing, are finding little markers, little things that other people share who have ancestry in common places, and highlighting that, or choosing to highlight that in this person's DNA. The truth is, or the reality is that we all have DNA that it's not like everyone, it's not like, for example, you and I will be that different at all. We all have genetic material that's basically connected because we're all one species. But what we're seeing here is little traceable statistical moments in DNA that are basically minor mutations that highlight that this for a while this mutation existed in Italy, and then it exists in other people around the world. For a while, this mutation existed in Eastern Europe, and now it exists in other places. It's a very complicated thing, and it requires an element of interpretation, but also, as archaeologists often say, interpretation often happens at the trowel's edge. As you are uncovering data, often forming in your mind a certain picture of what it is that you're looking at, and that informs what you think to say about what you're seeing.
Of course, and there's 2 points I think that come out very strong in the article too. And there's a quotation in direct quotes from a population geneticist called Dr. Simon Gravel, and that is talking about the population groups that they're referring to in the the broadly European and the Balkans and all the others. And he says, quote, they kind of need to take a pencil and more or less say, that's a region. And then different companies draw different circles. In other words, the companies interpret the regionality in different ways.
Yeah, entirely arbitrary lines on a map, basically.
Yeah. And of course, the other point that's worth making is that the genetic profiles that they use are the databases that they use are databases that are pretty much drawn from people living today who actually apply to some academic ones, which are then referenced to the ones that the people who apply to use their service.
Yeah.
So it's contemporary DNA that they're looking at. They're not looking at historic DNA from archaeological excavations, because the samples are much too small really to draw that sort of conclusion, I think.
And to a certain extent, what this relies upon is, certainly in the initial stages of this entire grand project, which has been going on now for 20, 30 odd years, in its incipient form at the beginning, is initially people reporting on their known ancestry, and then people starting to build up a picture of what that means when you look at their genetic profile and compare it to other people, say from the same village or from the same country or from the same region. Going back to this idea of arbitrary groups, though, in Ancestry DNA's results, they have groups of Eastern European and Russia, Italy. I mean, Eastern European and Russia, that's huge. Russia is like Italy on its own, Greece and the Balkans, Baltic states, and then Turkey and the Caucasus, Caucasus. The MyHeritage DNA results, as opposed to Ancestry DNA results, has categories of Balkan, Greek, so not Greek and Balkans. Balkan and Greek are separate. North and Western Europe, Middle East, and again Italian is distinct. And something that I'm interested in here as well is, I wonder why they choose to make certain groups distinct. Is that because these groups are identifiable, or is it because these groups are marketable results? So someone wants to know if they are part Italian or Irish in particular, or Scottish, or one of the ones that we often see on DNA adverts that slightly confuses me is when you see a result saying I'm a Viking. The Viking is often the one that turns up on the adverts, and how do you show that? You can show that DNA's come from Scandinavia, but at what point did it come into your family tree? It's a complicated story, but I suspect that some of these results are again formed and worded and categorized in a way that someone can say, brilliant, I am X% Italian.
And in fact, I think the game is given away by a couple of comments later on in the article. Simon Gravel, the geneticist who was quoted earlier, is also quoted as saying that these results are, quote, like a recreational scientific activity. And a couple of the companies, 23andMe and MyHeritage, are quoted as saying that the results that they pass on to their clients are, quote, ethnicity estimates.
ethnicity. Oh, that's also a very dangerous term
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
I mean, thankfully they stopped short of saying race, because I mean, goodness knows, yeah, it's all very. But again, what these words mean in this context is very odd. And what's also interesting is, so at the end, or towards the end of the article, we have, so the latter third of the article, lack of oversight is highlighted.
Well,
The biggest DNA ancestry companies have tested millions of people. MyHeritage, for example, says it expects sales of well over $100 million this year. Despite the popularity of ancestry testing, there is absolutely no government or professional oversight of the industry to ensure the validity of the results. And this was hinted at when Oxford Ancestors closed down, and Brian Sykes, in his, I suppose, open statement, I think it's still up there on the website now. He woefully had to admit that the industry was in a state of disarray, but also of companies offering the strangest of interpretations for results. For example, implying religious backgrounds, this kind of thing. The other day, actually, on the radio, I heard someone in a call-in context, sort of saying how their DNA had shown that their family was, oh goodness me, part Jewish, and you're like, well, okay, certainly part from that part of the world, so sort of Palestine, what is now Israel, that kind of area, perhaps, but that doesn't imply a religion necessarily.
No.
Or I think Brian Sykes hinted at the notion that some people were being told that they were part Islamic. You can't be part Islamic. Islam is not a
exactly. DNA is not cultural.
but also DNA. So yeah, DNA is not that. DNA and culture and language and religion exist separately, and so you can say someone in your ancestral tree came from that part of the world, and at that time they perhaps had these beliefs. But to tie your genetic stuff to cultural concepts is a very odd and dangerous thing, and a cultural concept can be a religion, but also it can be as simple as saying you are 10% Italian. It's an oddity, and it's entirely arbitrary. It's a human construct in that sense when we do this, and when we highlight and choose these little things to point at.
It's interesting. I mean, just in the last 20 years or so, there has been this move towards identifying your historical background as partly as a leisure activity through things like tracing family trees is perhaps the most common way of doing it, and then as the science developed, the ability to analyse your DNA to see where you might come from in terms of what journey your ancestors might have gone on. Has come into the picture, but it is a potentially emotionally sort of dangerous area too. We've seen numerous cases in family tree research, particularly on some of it's been publicised on programs like Who Do You Think You Are, where, for example, you've had people finding emotionally charged situations like they're defended from, for example, slave owners. We've had that in some response. I think the first one of those that struck me most was the late John Hurt, wonderful actor, but began the programme saying it was really important to him that he felt ethnically Irish, and it turned out that his family wasn't. At least as far as the family tree went.
Certainly not recently. I think it was one of those things where at some point further back, he probably had
some of his family had lived in Ireland, but that was
But it turns out that one of his ancestors had waxed lyrical about being descended from Irish kings or something. But that became very important to him. But what was also interesting is that in context in that show was that for John Hurt, he kind of held on to what that had given him in terms of comfort. And I do not for a moment I don't begrudge him that. I think that's part of his person, and that's fine. That's part of his personality. But it's when people have a sense that these results are absolute, and it's possible to have Irish DNA. It's possible to have DNA in common with other people who have at some point lived in Ireland, but that's not the same as having a four-leaf clover on your on your double helix. And actually, at the end of this particular article, I think they do well to highlight this, that results are subject to change. In September, Ancestry DNA informed customers that it had updated their estimates with the following message: your DNA doesn't change, of course, but we now have 13,000 additional reference samples and powerful new science to give you better ethnicity results. Your Ancestry estimates used in this story are from November the 6th, 2018, after the company updated the twins' results. So, again, it's one of those things where because of the fact that this is an ongoing project to actually build up what these results mean, we're constantly adding new comparisons, new connections, and this stuff shifts. It's not like there's little pointer that points to absolute points on a map or cultures. It's all about comparison, because as you quite rightly say, we don't have samples of people from the past to directly compare to. There's one final thing though, just before we close down this section that I'm curious about though, and that is what happens next, because there's a couple of stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
A couple of stories that have come to our attention, in fact, this morning, that are interesting in this context. So one of them comes from BuzzFeed News, not BuzzFeed News, there's a difference. And the headline being, one of the biggest at-home DNA testing companies is working with the FBI. The company in question being Family Tree DNA, as I hinted at earlier in this section of the video. And it turns out that they have been allowing the FBI to make use of their data for, I suppose, broad swathe checks to see whether or not there might be a possibility of tracking down people related to criminals.
Well,
it's a bit actually it's not entirely laid out clearly in the article, is it?
No. What is clear though is that they've been allowing them to do it. As you say, it's unclear exactly what the parameters are. Because the article says that the FBI does not have the ability to freely browse genetic profiles in the library. But it does appear they've been allowed access to the genetic library without a warrant.
Yeah.
Without any kind of legal oversight.
And also, presumably, if they're not freely allowed to look, they provide a sample to this company. The company goes, well, we think this, or these samples look like that sample. Again, it's all interpretation. But it's also fundamentally done without a warrant, and presumably I'm sure that there'll be permissions somewhere deep down in the thing that you have to sign when you send off your DNA kit or DNA sample to these companies. But I wonder how many people would be comfortable with this stuff happening, because this is not a government agency working with this government agency. This is a private company.
Yes.
That people are willingly offering up themselves to. Quite literally.
But I think it's necessary here to say that a lot of forensic work is now done by private companies. We're brought in as consultants on investigations. I can say that not in a scientific way, but I've worked as a private individual consulting to the police on a particular investigation. So that's something that happens routinely.
You don't get to keep hundreds of thousands of people's DNA profiles on servers.
Precisely, exactly. And there are, and particularly in the current fairly fraught climate where immigration, legal and illegal, and so on, is a hot button issue. You can see that people might begin to be very concerned if their DNA is being passed around to a government agency and with an investigative role and so on.
Frankly, immigration to one side. If someone who just happens to be genetically similar to me commits a crime,
well, we've seen
I won't necessarily know that person.
The subtle variations that are reported by these companies. Now you'd hope that forensic work will be done to a higher standard of analysis.
Hopefully.
But as we've said previously, there's no oversight. You're reliant on the oversight of the agencies concerned.
Oh, and don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that I would be hauled up in front of a judge for it. But the thing is, I don't know everyone who I'm related to. You know what I mean? And there are some people who by law I'm not related to, who nonetheless have inherited more or less the same DNA as me, or very similar DNA to me. There are interesting questions there as well. And also, very briefly as well, you highlighted this morning that the NHS is now offering free DNA tests to screen for potential susceptibility to certain illnesses.
Yes.
And again, there were questions there over what happens to those DNA profiles and how they're stored and who has access to them, which again isn't entirely clear. It's a little bit of a grey area. So we're in an interesting world.
It's not just that. I mean, it's actually going further than that. There was a story in the Guardian in the UK that was reported last weekend. Sorry, the weekend before last, rather. And the headline is NHS to sell DNA tests to healthy people in push to find new treatments. Now, the opening paragraph, healthy people in England are to be given the option of paying to have their DNA analysed by the NHS in an attempt to advance understanding and uncover new medical treatments, the Health Secretary has said. The service will be offered for free to people with serious genetic conditions. And it comes less than 2 months after the NHS researchers said they'd reached their goal of sequencing 100,000 genomes during 5 years of work on the 100,000 Genomes project. Now, that's fine and noble because obviously it's a cutting edge part of medical and bioscience. The genetic background to various conditions. The question there, though, is basically the NHS is meant to be free at the point of delivery according to need, which is fine. If you don't need something, maybe you're expected to pay for it.
Oh, so are you suggesting that if you're shown to be particularly susceptible to something, that you are almost like an insurance company, that you should have to potentially have a higher premium for that treatment?
It's not that. That's one of the dangers down the line of this. That you have to register your DNA profile with your insurance company before they'll give you insurance. You'll have to say if you've had your DNA tested. You know. But no, I think the real danger for this, the civil liberties argument that to question this, is that first of all, you've got the NHS basically collecting a product which it can use itself or sell on, and it's not clear under what circumstances and conditions this particular DNA database will be passed on, for example, to commercial companies. Now, and then the argument arises, well, actually, why should I pay to support the research of a private for-profit drug company?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because normally if a drug company wants me to help with its research, it pays me.
Yeah, or at the very least gives you a lollipop.
Absolutely. So,
But again, it just highlights that. Just going back to the initial opening gambit of this section, this highlights that this whole world of DNA. It's become a cultural touchstone. We all talk about something, as being in. If we talk about something being intrinsic, we talk about it in the DNA of something, of this, that, and the other. But very few of us really think about the implications of what the results of a DNA test actually mean, but also what it means to be trading or unknowingly trading in our DNA. It's an interesting offshoot of.
Well, I'd like to finish this little segment with a couple of quotes from the Guardian article, which I think actually works in the context of the historical DNA studies that we've been talking about as well, and particularly the commercial ones. Helen Stokes Lampard is the chairwoman of the Royal College of GPs, said, we're talking about very sensitive personal data that needs to be understood and used responsibly, and it raises a lot of ethical issues. A lot of things that will be picked up by genetic testing will be unimportant or of dubious value. That's a good generic point. The one that really gets it for me, nails it for me, is Annika Lucassen, who's the chairwoman of the British Society for Genetic Medicine, who told the Times newspaper, there is a lot of misunderstanding of what whole genome sequencing can deliver. There is a view that it will give you clear clinical predictions, and most of the time it will not.
No. Yeah. 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 No. Exactly. Exactly. So
We're dealing, that's the thing. We're dealing with a popular version of a very complicated science. It's a bit like reading the. And apologies for people who think I'm belittling comics. I'm not, but it's like reading the comic strip version of War and Peace.
No, come on. Graphic novels are incredible. Don't do that. Don't do that. But no, it's like okay.
They simplify the picture.
No. It's like watching the movie of a great book and thinking that you've understood every page. There you go.
Yeah, or have one of those 1 minute novel in
Like a
1
summary.
minute reads or whatever. Yeah,
exactly.
It's like reading the abstract of a paper.
Yeah, you can get a broad idea of what's going on, but even the people doing the work in the labs don't understand everything that's in front of them, or can't give it a letter by letter appraisal.